Back with another episode of the Rise of Women's Sports series. I'm so excited for this next guest. We have Chelsea Sherrod with us. She is a sports reporter and host for SNY, along with being the UConn women's basketball sideline reporter. Chelsea, I know you just did Mets off day, and working at SNY during the Mets season is not an easy feat. So I know it's got to be a little bit busy for you. How have you been?
I've been good, Julia. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, it's so funny. I've been talking all weekend about how the Mets being on the West Coast has completely shifted my sleep schedule,
Oh my
but
goodness.
we made it through. And I'm excited to be here with you. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, even just being a PA, it's like you really have to circle those trips on your calendar because it's like
Yes.
you're gonna be getting home at like 2 or 3 in the morning if you're lucky.
Yeah, you got to schedule those naps in during the day if you can.
100%. Well, I want to get started talking about some women's basketball because as a sideline reporter, I know that you've had a really just the best seat to the growth of the game in these past few years. So just a general overall question, how has that been being the UConn women's basketball sideline reporter during this time of growth?
Yeah, honestly, it's been for me like a dream. I'm from Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut. So, of course, I've been following UConn forever and Gina Oriema. And I was telling someone this the other day that within my first couple of weeks doing sideline with them and being able to go to their practices and shoot arounds and really just getting to know the team more, everything that I thought I knew about UConn or everything I thought about UConn basically was confirmed. Like the way that they go about their practices, their scheduling, the way that they treat their bodies, everything is of the highest quality. And it's almost like they're a team that chases perfection, but not in a toxic way. They're growing so much as women, as their own brands, especially with like, the rise of NIL and social media and things like that, but also just being able to see how much they respect the program. They respect Gino, who I call the godfather of basketball because he is. But the way that they really respect each other and they want to grow with each other. And I think it's just for me, just been a blessing to be able to, like you just said, have a front row seat to everything. And the way that women's basketball has grown over even like the last, I mean, I feel like the WNBA in general has been on a fast track since it launched. But I think over the past like 5 to 10 years, especially the last decade, women's basketball is almost like a rocket, like straight to the moon. And it's just been just, I don't even know the right word, just relieving to see, especially, I don't know if you played sports growing up, Julia, but I did. And from where women's basketball was or girls basketball was, is so different to where it is now. And it's just refreshing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me, like growing up playing sports and stuff, is like, I played basketball growing up and I was a follower of the WNBA. But you couldn't really have casual conversations about the WNBA with sports fans because they weren't aware of, what was going on. But now it's like, if you don't know who Caitlin Clark is, it's like, are you even following sports? So I think that shift
Right.
has been really, really cool to see just to be able to have casual conversations with sports fans about the women's game.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree. And I think we saw a lot of that during March Madness, especially in the Final Four this past year, because of one, all the different headlines from some of the things that were going on in the game, especially like even UConn's last game in the Final Four when they lost. The final play of that game was when Aaliyah Edwards got called for that offensive foul. And everyone was talking about it. It was all over social media. And the coolest thing was that not just people were having their back and forth and their debates and arguments or whatever, but just the fact that people were talking about women's basketball. And honestly, this past college season, especially, and this even this WNBA season, it's the hottest thing right now. That's all you're seeing on Twitter. It's all you're seeing on Instagram. And I'm just happy for the players that they're getting the recognition that they deserve. And obviously, it's been a long time coming, and there's still so much work to do. But you can see that like women's sports as a whole, but women's hoops specifically, is like the heartbeat of sports culture right now, which is really cool.
100%. And you mentioned earlier about how UConn kind of fosters a positive growth environment. And that's proven to be sometimes difficult to do. And, the person that's been the constant through all those years is Gino Oriema. So I was wondering from your perspective, what has Gino specifically done for the women's game, in your time being so close to the team because you go to practices, you go to games, you get to see, the stuff that no one else sees. So what is it about, Gino's coaching and leadership that makes this such a healthy environment?
Yeah, I think like the coolest thing about Gino in my experience with him is that now I'm kind of catching Gino coming off like the back end of this incredibly like huge mountain that he's had to climb. And so his perspective is a little different. There isn't as much pressure on him as he did have maybe in like his earlier years.
Mhm.
But when you think about it, he's going into his 40th season, and you think about the success that he's had over 4 decades is nuts. And he really took a UConn program that was pretty much nothing. And I don't want to say nothing, but we were talking about it throughout the season. And when they would play their games, like it wasn't in like Gampel Pavilion as we know it today. Like they were having to ask people to come to games and, not charging anyone. I don't know if they were charging people to get into games, but like their family members would come and like that would be their audience. And so I think for Gino, especially during a time, and of course, I'm not like over 40, so I can't really speak to my true experiences with that. But during that time, it's not like women's basketball was like the hottest thing on the market. And so I think he had a vision. I think that he loves the game in general. You ask anyone, and women's basketball, they will say that women's basketball is the most like fundamental sport. Like guys obviously are super talented, but they rely more on their athleticism. Women rely more on the fundamentals. And I think that Gino really is one of the like pioneers when it comes to that. Like he has really built so much success in a program. They've won obviously multiple national championships, and they've done it like consecutively too, which is insane to think about. Like you think about Brianna Stewart won a national championship every single year she was at UConn. And so when I talk to players about what Gino means to them and how he's developed them, they all say that he treats us like professionals. There's a certain level of quality that he goes into his day to day with. And it's not, when I watch him, he's not like yelling at them all the time or just like going in on them, but it's like, it's almost like when your mom or your dad sees you do something and they're like, I'm going to tell you this one time
Yeah.
and like you better get it type thing. Like he's kind of like that. And I think because of the success that he's had throughout his career, which has spanned 4 decades, there is a certain level of respect that players have for him so that they know when they step onto UConn campus, this is the way that they do things. This is the level that they expect you to do them at. And like, that's it because of all the work that he's done over time. And I think obviously there's so many great women's college basketball coaches over time who have also been pioneers just in like the game in general. Like you talk about like the Pat Summits and things like that. But Gino, I mean, UConn's the college basketball camp, like capital of the world for a reason. And I think it's because of the way that he has been able to foster talent, to create success, be a very productive program. And if you ask anyone, they will tell you that playing for Gino would be like playing for like almost like a basketball god, so to speak, just because of the way that he goes about things. So I don't know. He's had such an impact on the game, and I think even when he does choose to retire, he just signed an extension. But coming up on 40 years, you're expecting that to happen at some point. He'll have even more of an impact in his retirement. So yeah.
Absolutely. His track record couldn't be more, as far as like gaining respect of players. I don't know what
Yeah.
else you could do to
Yeah.
really earn that. I want to talk a
Yeah.
little bit about like, because you mentioned you were a UConn fan growing up. What was it like getting that first assignment working on a game?
Oh my gosh, it was so cool. I was so nervous. I was just saying this to one of my colleagues the other day. Um, it was like the coolest thing ever because just like being able to be so close to like Gino, a person who like I've just watched for so many years, it almost felt like surreal, honestly. Um, and I think too, even with them, and I was telling someone this, like when I go into games and you do your prep and you have your like pre-game meetings and you go over storylines and things like that. But like when the game comes like starts and the lights come on, it's like almost like you are a part of the game, which you pretty much are. You're a part of the broadcast. But like because like UConn and Gino, because they're so great, it's like you want to make sure that you put on the best performance as well. Like you want to cover these teams. And I'm sure people who cover other conferences or teams think the same, but you want to go into your assignments like, okay, I'm going to cover them in the best way possible, tell their stories, make sure that they feel heard when I'm relaying certain information and that it's factual and things like that. So I think when I first got my assignment, I was like, are you kidding me? And I was very much nervous the first time. And the best thing about the experience over the past year and a half, I guess, because I started not this past season, the season before, but I started in the postseason. Um, but I think with Gino, it's the best part about it has been able to build a certain rapport with him and his players. So they want to know that you respect them and what they do and their process and how much effort they're putting into everything they do. And in turn, they will respect you as well. And I think that from my experiences with them, that I've earned their respect, and it makes it that much more fun because they're willing to share their stories with you, talk to you. They know that the questions you're going to ask are quality questions. And I'm just really glad that we've gotten to that place together. So, yeah.
So your first game was a postseason game?
So my first game covering them was the Big East Conference. It wasn't Sideline because it wasn't on SNY's network.
Gotcha.
My first Sideline reporting game was this past season. I think it was a November game. Yeah, it was November. I'm trying to think of the date. But yeah, that was my first Sideline this past season. But last year I did Big East and the national tournament.
Nice. That sounds like an
Yeah.
incredible experience. That's like one of those bucket list kind of items for a sports journalist.
Oh my gosh, you have no idea. This past year was my first Final Four because the season before they lost in the Sweet 16. They've dealt with crazy injuries over the past couple seasons. But the Final Four is nuts. It's
Yeah.
like, it definitely is bucket list for sure. It's incredible. And yeah, you're watching the best athletes in the world at that level play. So it's like, you can't beat it.
That segues perfectly into my next question. What has the atmosphere been like when you're on the sidelines reporting, especially this past season? Of course, UConn has always like been the pinnacle of women's basketball, but with the amount of fans coming in, the Paige Beckers hype, Leah Edwards, players like that, this past season was really like a big year for UConn, and they made it very far in the tournament. So what was it like being on the sidelines with that kind of atmosphere?
Oh my gosh, the atmosphere is wild. Like Gamble Pavilion before, during, and after a UConn women's basketball game is like, I don't even know how to explain it. It's like energy like steroids. Like it's incredible. People love, and it's so funny because obviously in Connecticut we have the Connecticut Sun. But a lot of people for the longest time, viewed UConn as like, Connecticut's like team, like almost like they're like pro team. And so people from every part of the state, from the tri-state area, from Massachusetts, will come down to watch these games. And they are literally incredible. For me personally, it's very loud. And, when you're trying to listen to your producer and director in your ear, things can get very loud.
Yeah.
And so for me, my first couple of games, part of my experience was working through the noise and listening to the things that were important to listen to. And sometimes that means, I have in one IFB at times or two IFB at times, making sure that I'm hearing things clearly. But it's a lot of fun. Like people show up and show out. There are, very loyal fans who go to every single game. They're very happy to see SNY, which is great. And they appreciate our coverage, which I love so much, because when I am at the games, people are happy to see us. They're excited for, what we're going to do. But it's very loud. I think loud is the best word for me to describe the atmosphere. But it's like, it's the coolest thing ever. Every single game feels like, and it's funny because, sometimes they'll blow out teams. But I think with, the rise of women's basketball and the development of women's basketball, there are better players across the board. So games aren't always blowouts anymore. And I think because of that, because they're more competitive, it's more exciting to watch. And so almost every game feels like a playoff game just because of the atmosphere.
Yeah, the parity in NCAA basketball right now is definitely a lot better, specifically with UConn.
Yeah.
But something about UConn women's basketball fans that's like really funny to me is that they really love TikTok. Like they are
They do.
they are all over videos. And there's a lot of times on my For You page, like it'll be like an interview, and I'm like, oh my God, that's Chelsea in that. So I
Yeah.
have to ask you, what has been your best moment from sideline reporting? Because I've seen quite a few of just like clips of you sideline reporting. Because as I said before, UConn women's basketball fans, they're quick to it. They're all over
They
this. So
are.
I have to ask you, what's been your favorite moment?
Oh my gosh, it's so funny because one day I was home with my sister and like randomly she was like, "Did you see this TikTok? Like you're on this TikTok." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And that was a hilarious moment. But I've had so many great moments like with Gino. One game at halftime, it was hilarious. I was asking Gino about like what his team has to do to get going or to fix some of the issues. I think I said, Coach, what do you need to do to fix some of these issues? And he said, I don't know. Maybe go to Lowe's, Home Depot. That'll help us, right? And I was
There's
just
no
like,
way.
are you kidding? And so our play-by-play and color analysts, Meg Como and Alan Bestwick, they were cracking up as soon as he said it. It was so funny. And I'm just like, Coach, like, but it was so funny in the moment. And like, that's how he is. And I think that also kind of shows his playful side, the rapport that we've built, which is great. I think it was during, I don't know if it was Marquette. I think it was a Marquette game. It was away. And Paige hit a shot at the buzzer from like mid-court, like from the logo. And after the game, I asked her about it. And I was like, can you teach me how to hit shots from the logo? And she was like cracking up and she was like, yeah, I had to redeem myself and I'm glad I hit it. And so that was a fun like back and forth with her. And
Yeah.
then I think this was the second game, our second game of the season. It was a home game. They were playing, is it Ball State? It was Nika Mule's sister's school. So it was really nice because they were playing against each other for the first time. Her family members were there, like her parents had flown over from Croatia. So that was a really, really nice moment. Her and her sister got to take photos after. So that was really cool. I could rattle off a lot of different moments, but like those three really stand out just because I think sometimes, and like young journalists ask me this all the time. Sometimes you go into games or assignments, and yes, you're supposed to take them seriously, and yes, you need to be prepared. But at the end of the day, we're covering sports, so it should be fun at the same time. And this is also me taking a bit of my own medicine because my producers and directors will tell me this too. Have fun.
Mhm.
And so in those moments I just mentioned, those were more of like the human side of things, like the playful, like let's just like talk about this or let's have fun with this, or that was a really cool moment, or let's laugh for a second. So I appreciate the fact that like, Paige and Gino and Nika, who always gives great answers, I'm gonna miss her, allowed me to be on the receiving end of those moments.
And this is a team that's super fun, like personality wise too. You look at like
Yeah,
KK Arnold, Paige
yeah.
Beckers, the list really goes on. So I can imagine, and Gino is a personality, of course, within himself. So I can imagine that, specifically with this team and this program, sideline reporting has got to be like just a ton of fun. It's easier to take yourself out of it and just have fun.
It's so much fun. And I think like the moments where we're either just at shoot around or in the locker room and just talking to them are the most fun moments too, because, they're just like, that's like their space, and they're
Yeah.
allowing us to be in there and they're just like having fun doing what they do. KK Arnold is like the most fun person. She is absolutely hilarious. Every time I talk to her, it's like jokes.
Yeah.
Every single time I see her, literally I will see her and walk up to her and we will just start laughing. Like it's like she is so much fun and she's like that all the time. Like she's so authentic, she's so genuine. And I appreciate that from her because sometimes when you're talking to someone like myself who you just met, you might not be willing to show that side of you. But I think the more that we got to know each other, the more that relationship has built. But they make it, and Gino has done this again for so long. He just gets it. Like
Yeah.
he knows what's coming. He knows you want to ask him questions at half and at the end of the game. Granted, depending on how the game is going, you address those questions in a certain way. But he just gets it. And so they do make our lives very fun, relatively easy, and it makes the broadcast that much more special too.
Well, let's move over to some basketball talk because UConn is definitely in a in a good position, I would say, as long as, the injury stuff has just been crazy to watch as a fan. Like
Yeah.
it's almost like every time I see a UConn headline, it's like I'm bracing myself for an ACL injury because last
Yeah.
season was tough, the season before was tough. But Paige Beckers is coming back for another year, using her
Mhm.
COVID year. Obviously, the projected number one pick in next year's draft. And with expansion
Yeah.
teams, there's different implications there too, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
as someone who obviously follows women's basketball and UConn women's basketball a lot like yourself, what should the expectations be going into next season? Because it's really easy to be like UConn championship or bust, but do you feel like that is like a reasonable expectation next season?
1,000%.
Gotcha.
That's exactly what it should be.
Understood.
um, and I think, when you look at UConn in general, that always is their expectation given their history. But I think because Paige is deciding to come back, when she announced that at senior night last year, there was a huge like, okay, you're going for it type thing. I think that's also why Aubrey Griffin is deciding to come back, because they want to go for it. Gino's 40th season, like it's kind of like the stars are starting to align in a way. I think all eyes will be on UConn. They are, what I believe, the front runner. Obviously, you talk about like South Carolina and things like that. There's been a lot of movement with teams lately. Um, but I think that, yeah, UConn should be one of the favorites to win this year. Paige, to me, is the best playmaker in all of women's college basketball. I thought the same last season. The way that she's able to get her teammates involved, the way that she's able to perform at such a high level on both sides of the floor makes her that way. She just is. So I'm expecting a huge season from her. Having AZ Fudd back is going to be huge for them as well. Another offensive presence. KK Arnold growing in her second year. Ashton Shade was like automatic. Like when she's on, she is on. And obviously the two of them are only getting better after a year under their belt. I think Ice Brady really started to come to form towards the end of last season as well. I think she'll be huge for them. Jana Alafi, who is one of their bigs who got injured because she tore her Achilles the
Yep.
summer before last season. She is a dog, apparently. This is what I'm hearing.
Right.
This will be her first full season with them, or her first season with them. And she's going to be a huge presence on the inside. So I think that they have built a championship roster. It really just comes down to obviously health and things like that. But I think that if UConn does stay healthy, they should win the national championship. I mean, even look at last season, they made it to the Final Four with a team who literally was like a bus with like one wheel. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it was like, I don't know how they did it, but it's because of the way they train, the way they prepare, the players that they have. And Paige Beckers, like she is absolutely phenomenal. She's a leader on this team. They trust her, they believe in her. And I think that she will lead them to a national title for sure.
I think that's kind of the general public opinion right now. And for
Yeah.
UConn, it is a perfect storm kind of for all of the things that, that went wrong in the past few seasons. And it's really good timing now because you think about because like next year is going to start a bit of a new generation for UConn.
Mhm.
Not as much as like a complete retooling like South Carolina had to do, but when you think about a new era of women's basketball now for UConn versus 10 years ago, it was like every single player that came out of high school basketball wanted to go to UConn, and that's
Yeah.
still that I would still say UConn is definitely like the number one place people want to go, but the parity,
Mhm.
as we mentioned before, is definitely a lot more close now that Iowa's in the
Yeah.
mix, South Carolina, Don Staley. So I think this is
Yeah.
a really important year for UConn because it's going to be a little bit more difficult to get those number one recruits in years to come. But it seems like, as I said
Yeah.
before, it's just all of the right things going for UConn now, which hasn't been able to be said in the past couple years with injuries.
Yeah. No, I agree. And of course, they brought in Sarah Strong, who was the
Mhm.
number one overall
Yep.
recruit in the country, which is huge. And also, she comes from a basketball family. Her mom, Allison Feaster, who's in the front office with the Celtics, coming off a
Oh, wow.
championship. So there are a lot of storylines that will come into play this season. But yeah, I agree with you. And I think the leveling of the playing field helps the sport. Um, I think that it does also help UConn in a way, because you don't want to play. And granted, they haven't had this issue in the past really, but like you want to play at a certain level. And sometimes when you play teams who aren't as good, you could play down to their level or things
Yeah.
like that. But I do think the competition helps because it prepares you for the postseason because you know anything can happen during March Madness. But yeah, I think it's overall just great for the sport. It makes the games that much more interesting. We see the best players playing, showing out for their teams. And so I do think though that like this is the year. Like if they're going to get it done for this class of players, it's like you look at Paige's class when Aaliyah and Nika and everything they have been through. Paige is like, okay, I have one more shot to get this done. I think she's going to do everything in her power to make sure that happens. And they were literally like that close
Yeah.
last year to being in the national championship game. So I mean, obviously the field thinks that they should win national championships. Sometimes you're like, all right, like maybe not because everyone thinks so, whatever. But I
Mhm.
genuinely believe that this could be a really great year for them. So
Absolutely. And one more question for you, Chelsea. Thank you again for
yeah,
taking the time.
of
I,
course.
I always end these with the same question because when I'm talking to different people in different facets of, the women's sports industry, if you will, I always get a really cool perspective from this question. With the NCAA, the growth has been incredible, but there is still like the ceiling is so much higher than
Mhm.
like the growth has been great, but there's so much growing to do. What do you hope to see from the NCAA, whether it be from the business side of things, the player side of things? What do you hope happens to continue to make sure this is a capitalization on growth and the positive growth continues to trend in the right direction?
Wow, that's a really, really, really great question. Um, wow, I need a moment to think about that. What do I want to see from the NCAA to help perpetuate even more growth for women's basketball? I mean, I guess what I would love to see is just, I guess, more opportunity. And I think with more opportunity, that means financial opportunity, more ways for students to be able to capitalize off of their brands. And obviously, NIL has evolved so much over the past couple
Mhm.
of years, really. It kind of really started post COVID. But I think like that has been huge for players. But I think that um, there are obviously more opportunities for that. I think with March Madness, of course, we saw a few years ago the discrepancy between the men's and women's tournaments. I think that even this past season, there was a moment where during the women's tournament, wasn't there a moment where there was like a 3 point line that wasn't measured
Yeah.
properly?
Yes, they
Yeah.
were uneven.
So they were uneven. Those things cannot, like, what that should
Would
never
never
happen.
happen in a men's tournament.
Exactly, exactly. So I think like there needs to be obviously more attention to detail, more consideration for the women who are out there playing, for the programs who are spending money to get there. So I think from the NCAA, what I would love to see is just more effort put into the women's game financially, um, operationally, especially with that 3 point line discrepancy. And then, yeah, just more opportunities for the players to benefit off of, I guess, their name, image, and likeness. But I think, unfortunately, over the past couple of years, we have just seen it's almost like one thing after the other.
Yeah,
Like if it's not this or they fix this, like with the weight room situation,
right.
that happened, and then it's like, okay, we're gonna fix it, and then like this happens, and it's just like no, the same effort and time and production you put into the men's side of things that has to be into the women. And to be quite frank, the women's game, women's college basketball was talked so much more than the men's tournament as a
Yep.
whole. As a whole, you
And
can
viewed
ask
more.
someone, yeah, and the viewership numbers were crazy, but you could literally ask someone who was in like the Elite Eight of the women's tournament this past year versus the men's. And I'm sure they could probably name more women's teams, honestly.
Yeah.
So that is where the attention is. You need to put more resources towards that attention. I think it's unfortunate that we're still here in this moment talking about this, but I just hope that as far as the NCAA is concerned, and for their own sake, that they will just continue to grow in that way and just be more of a positive reinforcement for teams and for players who are really bringing so much attention to their organization. So, yeah.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And thank you so much, Chelsea, once again. This has been incredible.
You're
Really
welcome.
appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Of course.